Thank you for tuning in to The Global Novel. I'm Claire Hennessy. The word Inferno is the Italian for hell, an imaginary creation by the 14th century poet Dante. The Inferno is the first part of the Divine Comedy, followed by Purgatorio and Paradiso. One of the most therapeutic books in the world, it is about a hero's journey through hell, guided by the ancient Roman poet Virgil. In the poem, hell is described as 9 concentric circles of torment located within the earth. It is, to quote the original, the realm of those who have rejected spiritual values by yielding to bestial appetites or violence, or by perverting their human intellect to fraud or malice against their fellowmen. Since its publication, over 129 translators have shared their creative attempts in translating the work, and more frequently among these translations are English. With us today is Professor Marco Sonzogni from Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand, who will talk about how different versions of translation highlight the thematic tension of Inferno. Hello, Marco. So excited to have you join the show. Could you please introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so my name is Marco, and I studied languages at university. I always loved languages. I did my undergraduate studies in Italy, and then I did my postgraduate studies in Ireland, where I was for 12 years. I also started my academic career there, and then life circumstances, a job came up in New Zealand, I applied, and I pretty much did what Dante does at the end of Inferno, a somersault, and I came out the other side and in the other hemisphere, and I've been here now 16 years, and recently somebody called me a literary trickster and a cultural activist. I like to think of those two terms as describing me accurately. I love my job. My passion is to share cultural patrimony that's been shared with me and to pass it on for future generations. So I think, and I do that with a slightly counter, I like to look at things from a different perspective. And coming to New Zealand, in a way, I know it may sound cheap, but coming on the other side of the planet, literally, as well as allegorically, did change my view of things. You ask questions in a different way. You look at them in a different way. The sky moves in a different way. Mm-hmm. You open the tap, the water circles in a different way. So that's very refreshing, and it's also very humbling. You stop your prejudices, you leave your baggage, and you look afresh. And I think that's exactly what Dante does when he lifts up his head out of hell. He looks up at the sky, he sees, so this is different. And he sees the Southern Cross, which I see every day. So every day that I see the Southern Cross, I think of Dante. There you go.
Sounds wonderful. So let's start with the context. Could you talk a bit about why Dante was exiled and how this painful experience and philosophical reflection on it shaped the narrative structure of the poem?
Yes, now, sometimes we think of the Middle Ages as, very distant from us. But I think one of the things that Dante, the reason why Dante, 700 years after his death, 701 year after his death, is still there, is he was a 360-degree human. Mm-hmm. He came into life at a time of turmoil. The Middle Ages, a lot of things were changing. Italy was a collection of states, of languages, of cultures, of currencies. And his family, I think when Dante is born into Florence in one of the rare occasions where the Ghibellini party is in power. And I think he is from a Guelph family, not too influential. So he is there, and he finds himself aware of, if you like, change about to happen, or change, when those moments where you're on the crisp of change. And I think it's an exciting moment. And I think as we're trying to come out of a pandemic, big crises are always a prelude for big changes. So that he is, and I think he's a principled man, is what I like to think of as a committed civilian. He cares about the city, he cares about the state, he cares about values. And he's an intellectual. He probably reads everything that he can set his hands on. He reads a lot in translation. Mostly, he couldn't speak Greek, so everything that he reads, he would have come to him through Latin translation. And then, he starts thinking, what makes us a society, what makes us a place, what makes us people, and language and literature for him are an important, and politics are an important part of it. And his political views. I think I don't want to call it political views, because to this day, there are people that question, was he Guelph or was he Ghibellino? There are people saying one side of the story, people saying one other side of the story. What I'd like to say is that he was 100% aligned with his values. Mm-hmm. And of course, that created tensions. He probably got on the wrong side of the stick with many people. And he had to leave. And I think the exilic experience, and I might fast track a bit, and I'm thinking of a similar experience, for example, that the poet Shemusini did when he left Northern Ireland for the South. Was liberating. He started writing. He gave him a sense of the country, a sense of Italy, this constellation of languages and states. He also experienced patronage, so he experienced help, but he also experienced, how salty the bread that is cooked by others is, as he says, quanto sa di sale lo pane altrui, And it's, I think, through that kind of challenge, he fortified his own beliefs, but also his own literary mission, and he gifted us this wonderful poem. I think it's actually, it's actually the story of everybody's life. We go to hell. We have to go to hell. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the Italian people and the Italian government chose the end of Inferno when we came out of lockdown. Inferno is a very advanced form of literary lockdown, if you allow me to use this, this expression.
So how is the poetic fashion of courtly love, and especially Dante's own courtly love with his childhood lover, Beatrice, reflected in the poem? And how does the figure of Beatrice help the hero's journey in the poem?
It's a very, very, very good question. Now, among the many things that were changing at the time, there was this kind of new school of poetry. I'm using this school of poetry, which was the Dolce Stil Novo, which wasn't just a school of poetry, it was a school of thinking, a school of life. And the origin of Italian poetry is in music, is in singing, troubadours singing, and you need an inspiration. You're not necessarily singing for yourself. So the idea of some sort of enhancing and heightening form of inspiration. And the Dolce Stil Novo believed in courtly love. And in my years in Ireland, I realized that there are various forms in world literature where courtry love, a sort of platonic love that is not physical, is not sexual, but it is an instrument for elevation, for spiritual elevation. And so Dante in this is not alone. There are other poets that he learned from and writes in the same time, writes in the same fashion. And I think when he meets Beatrice, like when Petrarca meets Laura, whether fictional or allegorical, there is this sort of intervention of a muse that is codified as female and beautiful. And she could be real, she could be allegorical, but that's an opportunity to undertake a journey of elevation. And that's exactly what Dante does. I mean, she only comes in towards the end of the book, and he chooses a fellow poet to do the dirty work and be ready for when he's ready to meet her, then she becomes an instrument for further elevation. So, and that's not a bad way of figuring out a muse. Again, whether we want to believe in Beatrice and Laura as real people or imagine personified values, it never bothered me. But I like to think of Dante, and I'll tell you this story. I read a wonderful book about him. It's a fictional book by Giulio Leone, I think, and it's one of the finest books on fictionalized account of Dante's life that I've ever read. He's also he meets, if I remember correctly, an Arabic-looking Muslim woman in a tavern, and he's completely seduced by her. So this is the most anti-Dantean account of Dante that I've ever come across, but he makes him real. And that's what I love about the poet. This poet was, he was a man at a time engaged with the politics, paid a hard price. He was in battle. He saw what man is capable of, for better and for worse. And then went off and wrote 100 cantos of a poem that is edifying, is universal, is eternal in the way that it charts every human's opportunity to grow intellectually and spiritually if we want to. I mean, people will say this is very Christian and is very hellish and is very, dark ages. we don't write in isolation. Dante is a product of his own time and of his own readings and of his own ideas. But as I told you before we went on air, when people say that, my answer would be, where will you be in 700 years? Will anybody talk about you and me in 700 years? Probably not. So if 700 years on, we're still here talking about Dante, it means that he strokes some chords that are universal and that it touch, every human's life question very deeply.
Right. Could you tell us a bit about the language that Dante used to write this poem? How different Tuscan is from Virgil's Latin? Because we know that Latin was then considered a highly respected language of the elite society, right? It's absolutely fascinating that how the vernacularism of Tuscan describing a once obsolete worldview could make the poem a now celebrated iconoclast and linguistic invention.
That's a very good question. You could be talking about this for like a week. Now, if you're a writer, you start thinking, okay, what I want to do? How do I want to write? What language am I going to write? And then at some point you're going to ask the question, okay, if I want to get a job, what language am I going to use? And Latin was the language that every learned person at the time would write, Right. So, but then you start thinking, okay, I'm writing in this language. Will I be understood by how many? Mm-hmm. What are the options? I mean, that question, what we call in Italian, we call la questione della lingua, will continue to come right away to, people think of Italy, maybe people associate Italy, as we've always been there. Well, the truth is we've been there as Italy only since 1861. Before then, we were a collection of states, each of which had its own language, its own dialect, its own currency, its own politics, its own way of doing things. So partly through exile, it's interesting because Dante writes this book called De Vulgari Eloquentia, which is a treaty on the purposes of having a sort of enhanced vernacular as a shared language. And he finishes in book, he wanted to write 4 books, and then he gets to chapter 14 in book 2 and he stops very abruptly. Scholars are trying to figure out what happened there. But I think it's a legitimate question. Now, I'm answering you also a little bit by detour. So Petrarca writes 365 sonnets for Laura, and he says, I'm very sorry, folks, this is not a serious piece of work because I'm using the vernacular. And then everybody remembers him for the vernacular, and nobody almost, unless you're a scholar of Petrarch's other writings. So sometimes things happen for a reason. You want to unify a group of people, a society. You want to find a way to be readable and accessible. Mm-hmm. As a writer, myself, I want to be read by as many people as possible, and I have a choice. Am I going to write in a language that only a certain group will read? And then the other question will be, I think Dante had a pretty learned reader in mind when he wrote the Commedia, because all the allusions, all the quotations, all the references to the sources that are now made explicit in footnotes, they weren't exactly there at the time. So he sort of assumed that people would recognize them. I remember a scholar, we shall leave him nameless because he was one of my mentors and I loved him dearly. He said, the Divine Comedy is an appendix to the Aeneid. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, but there are a lot of similarities, and you can see that. But so the question is, you want to be learned, you want to be read, you want to be accessible, you want to make money, you want to become famous, you want the court to love you. These are all the questions, and I think at some point you go around, you find, and that's what Manzoni also did. Manzoni wrote I Promessi Sposi, which is another love story, if you like, and he wrote it in Milan. He is set in Milan, and then at some point he says, let me go to Florence, he says, to wash my clothes in the Arno, so to purify the language so that it loses dialectal and sort of foreign influences and it becomes more accessible and readable by everybody. Now, that's what 1840, so that's 20 years before Italy has anything but a geographical unification. So Dante, in a way, sets in motion la questione della lingua. What is the language that we're going to write about? And just before him, I think a little bit before him, the poets were writing in various forms of Proto-Italian. And if you ask me, it is very different from Latin. It's certainly very different from Virgil's Latin. But language evolved like we do. Language age. Every language ages through time. That's right. Gets in contact with other languages. I don't like to use the word corrupted. It gets contaminated, or it gets into contact with other linguistic possibilities. And who else but a writer can understand those points of contact better? And every serious writer will ask themselves the questions, which language am I going to write? Now, if we want to make make it an issue in a political issue, yeah, let's make it a political issue. At some point it becomes an issue of power balance. Indigenous people, the Maori here in New Zealand, some of them write in Maori, and they have a very limited readership. Others, they do a counter-colonial, a post-colonial revenge. They take English and make English become their voice. So the question of which language I'm going to write in and why will always going to be there. And I think someone like you with a hyphenated identity, having, English and Chinese, you'll be voicing different issues or different missions or visions about what you want to do and who you want to be through language. We are using this language with literary intentions. You're making a statement, and then people will say, "All right, why?" So and then from then on, Italian develops out of literary Tuscan. But if somebody else had said, and they could have said, I mean, where poetry is born? Poetry is born in the courtship of Frederick II in Sicily. The first sonneteers, Cielo d'Alcamo, all these people, they're there. If somebody there said, all right, this is the Italian literary language, from now on we're using this one. But anyway, so that's a lot of story. I think that's why I love Italian so much, because there are multiple origins and languages in it that have made it what it is. And yes, we descend from Latin, but it's a long journey that is still continuing today.
In your opinion, why does Divine Comedy and especially Inferno attract Anglophone translators most?
It's a very good question. I mean, for starters, it's what I call, it's a three-dimensional book. You like this idea of we all like a bit of crime and punishment stuff. If you speak too much, you're going to be burning in hell and not being able to speak. If you had too much sex, or if you were adulterous, then you're going to be chasing the person you want to be, and you never touch her. So this idea of, sort of Manichaean, black and white, good or right and wrong, and we are all sort of feel very human. Every single possible aspect of humanity, from sex to food, politics, loyalty, disloyalty, they're all there. So they're very real stories. We can understand them. Now, with Purgatorio and Paradiso, it becomes, for many, very theological, very abstract. It's all about light and music and whispers, So Inferno has this, and if you think about, a lot of Dante's translators into English, they were Victorian, even Protestant ministers, people that said, "Oh, here we've got example. If you don't behave, you don't leave, this is what happens to you." And fantastic. Rather than letting the Bible tell you that, why not use a work of literature to do that? I was astonished to see how many priests and pastors and ministers try to translate Divine Comedy. I remember this guy in Nottingham, it was Reverend Plumtree, who translates the first 5 cantos of Inferno, sends them on to Cardinal Newman, who sort of reads them and he says, "Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, they're not too bad." And then he says, "I was reading someone else's translation and it made me fall asleep." But it's clearly, as I say, everyone would recognize in Inferno, and maybe that's the purpose. "Oh, I've done that. Oh yeah. Oh, I see what he talks about." And so they're very real stories, and stories that we can relate to. And also, the idea of going through dark times, whether it's a forest or your room because you're depressed, or your office because you're being bullied, or the trenches of war in Ukraine, we are all going through some form of hell in one way or another. I cannot think of one person I know that hasn't been through hell and back once. So that is a very relatable story. Now, if you're telling people about the earthly paradise, loads of birds and lovely fruits and vegetables, and it's warm and you don't need any clothes, then I say, okay, I can go to Samoa. And that's exactly it. Earthly paradise exists. But as George Steiner said, earthly paradise must have been very boring. You don't need language. You have direct communication with God. You're completely pure. Everything is perfect. It's a bit boring after a while. But Inferno, that you've got the juice, that you see the good and bad of humans, more bad than good. But there's always hope, and Dante gives you that. It tells you in Canto 3, go through this door, there's no hope. But he is a firm believer in hope. Even Inferno ends with stars. You've come up. We come up to see the stars again. Also, I often thought, I haven't done a lot of research into this, but I've spent a lot of time with Buddhist and Hinduist friends, and with Vaishnava, with spiritual, Vaishnava scholars and sages, and Nirvana.
We hope you have enjoyed the episode so far. If you want to hear the entire episode, you can subscribe at theglobalnovel.com/subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.